Once upon a time, in a kingdom swaddled in mist, where the Thames moved like liquid pewter and ravens whispered secrets atop crumbling castle walls, there lived a man who could not decide what love should mean, or perhaps, more precisely, who it should wear. His name you know already. It echoes through the stone corridors of history like the low toll of a distant bell. Henry VIII. King of England, supreme head of the church, lord of many banquets, and even more heartbreaks. But this is not just his story, not really. No, this is the story of the 6 women who stood beside him, or knelt before him, or found themselves written out of his chapter like smudged ink on a royal scroll. 6 queens, 6 lives, 6 very different hearts, all entangled in one man's hunger for a son, a dynasty, and perhaps, though he might not admit it, something resembling affection. There's something terribly poetic about them, these women, each one walking into the same gilded cage, never quite knowing how sharp the bars would be. Kathryn of Aragon, noble and unyielding, and Boleyn, sharp as glass and twice as breakable. Jane Seymour, pale and silent as snowfall, and of Cleves, foreign and misread like a misunderstood book. Kathryn Howard, young as spring but gone too soon, and Kathryn Parr, the survivor, who read the room better than anyone else. They weren't just names in a rhyme to help schoolchildren remember who lived and who didn't. They were real, tender and tired and tangled in silk and sorrow. Queens with callous hands from prayer, hearts that beat a little faster behind velvet bodices, and dreams that flooded like trapped birds against the iron of Tudor expectations. Imagine them, dear dreamer, not in portraits, but as breathing, blinking women, standing by stained glass windows as candlelight flickered against their pale cheeks, whispering secrets into the folds of their gowns, praying for sons, for safety, or simply for morning to come. And at the center of it all, Henry. Mercurial, monstrous, merry. A man once called handsome, now growing round with power and spoiled meat. His crown heavy. His mood heavier. His love, if we dare call it that, conditional as the English weather. This isn't a tale of battles and borders, but of banquets and betrayals. Of wedding feasts that ended with funeral marches. Of Tudor roses blooming one moment, and wilting the next beneath a gaze colder than the marble tombs that would one day house them. So tonight, as the wind hums like a lute outside your window and the world grows drowsy, let us slip quietly into the shadows of Hampton Court, and listen for the soft rustle of silk skirts, the hush of a queen's prayer, the ghost of a sigh that never quite faded. And before the stars grow quiet, subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment if this soft story stirred something in you. Before we dive into today's story, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? Because I know that you, me, and everyone else tuned into this video, we all share the same little habit, even if we're scattered across the world, far from one another. Long before Henry was a king in full bloom, before his beard grew thick with pride and his waist with indulgence, there was a girl. She was not English, though she would come to love England as a wife loves a moody husband. No, she was Castilian, Spanish, born in a world of golden altarpieces and Catholic certainty. Her name was Catalina, but the English would call her Kathryn. She arrived in England with fire in her blood and Spanish lace at her wrists, promised to a future king, Arthur, Prince of Wales. Not Henry, not yet. Arthur was the elder, the one England had prepared for. And Kathryn, just 16, was his bride. But fate is a fickle mistress. Within months of their wedding, Arthur fell ill and slipped from the world like a shadow at dusk. Kathryn, a widow before she was a woman, was left alone in a foreign land, wrapped in mourning and uncertainty. What followed were 7 long, slow years. Years of waiting, of political wrangling, of letters sent across seas and alliances made and unmade like a child's game of stones. All the while, Kathryn remained, her pride intact, her heart heavy, her Spanish robes slowly worn down by English dust. And then came Henry. Young, broad-shouldered, golden-haired. He was everything Arthur had not been, and for Kathryn, perhaps, everything hope had promised. They married in 1509. She was 23. He 18. For a while, it seemed a fairy tale might yet bloom in Tudor soil. Henry called her his dear and true wife. They danced, they hunted, they prayed side by side. Kathryn became queen not just in title, but in bearing, regal, learned, devout. She knew Latin. She knew theology. She knew how to move a court with a glance and a word. But she could not, it seemed, give him a son. She bore many children. Most were lost. One daughter survived, Mary, a girl, clever and solemn, but not the heir Henry so desperately sought. And so, slowly, the love story frayed. Kathryn aged. Henry looked elsewhere. And as the years passed, the woman who had once walked into England like a summer storm found herself cast aside like yesterday's prayer. He tried to annul the marriage. She refused. With iron in her spine, she declared herself Henry's true wife and queen until the end. Even as Boleyn flitted into favor, Kathryn clung to her dignity like a relic. She was banished, yes. Separated from her daughter. Left to live out her days in cold castles, where the rain tapped gently on the windows like the fingers of regret. But she never relented. Not once. She died in 1536. Alone, but unbowed. Her last letter to Henry began, "Mine eyes desire you above all things." Even in exile, her heart remained loyal. Or perhaps, simply tired. And so, as her story fades into shadows, another begins. If Kathryn was a candle burning slow and steady, and Boleyn was a spark, bright, crackling, and impossible to ignore, she didn't enter court like a queen. She arrived like a question. Dark-haired, sharp-tongued, and clever in all the wrong ways, or the right ones, depending on who you asked, and Boleyn was never meant to be queen. She was meant to smile from the sidelines, to marry well, serve quietly, and disappear into some manor house draped in ivy. But didn't disappear. She shimmered. She played the game differently. And Henry noticed. He was a king grown restless. Kathryn's grace had become too familiar. The lack of a male heir gnawed at him like a sleepless thought. And then came an, not beautiful in the way tapestries taught women to be, but captivating. Her eyes held entire books. Her voice could unlace pride. And she did something no other woman had dared. She said no. She would not be his mistress. She would not be his secret. If Henry wanted her, he would have to crown her. And so, a kingdom bent to her will. The Reformation was not born in a church, dear dreamer, but in the spaces between letters. Between the king and a woman who refused to kneel, unless it was for coronation. To marry Anne, Henry would break with Rome, shatter centuries of tradition, and build a new church with himself at the head. All for love. Or lust. Or legacy. And Anne? She bore it all. The whispers, the hatred, the exultation, with her chin slightly lifted and her heart locked away. When she was crowned queen in 1533, bells rang across London. Yet many listened in silence, already predicting the fall behind the rise. And then, the child. A girl. Elizabeth. Not the son they had prayed for. Not the anchor Henry craved. But a daughter who would one day hold the crown longer than any Tudor. Still, in that moment, it was not enough. And miscarried again. And again. The very fire that had drawn Henry to her began to scorch his patience. The court turned cold. Whispers grew louder. She had enemies, many. Friends, few. In May of 1536, she was arrested. Charged with adultery, incest, treason, a storm of lies dressed in legal robes. The trial was a performance. The verdict was decided before the curtain even rose. She was taken to the Tower of London. Not screaming, but steady. On the scaffold, she spoke gently of the king. Of mercy. Of God. Her neck was slender. Her heart, we'll never know. The sword fell swift. And so ended Anne Boleyn. Not with a son. Not with a throne. But with a silence that still echoes in the cold morning air. And so, as her story fades into shadows, another begins. Jane Seymour did not sparkle like in, nor did she speak with Kathryn's fire. She was a hush in a noisy court, a sigh, not a song. The third wife of Henry VIII came like a still winter morning, after a storm that had shaken the very walls of England. By the time Jane stepped into Henry's gaze, the fires of Anne's downfall were still smouldering. It was May of 1536, and had been executed on the 19th. Henry and Jane were betrothed by the 20th, married by the 30th. Yes, 10 days after one queen's fall, another wore her ring. Jane was not made of thunder. She was made of quiet things, obedience, patience, pale gowns and folded hands. Where Anne had challenged, Jane consoled. Where Kathryn had clung to righteousness, Jane clung to silence. Henry, weary of resistance, found her softness soothing. And perhaps, for a time, Jane loved him. Or at least she tried to. She had served under both Kathryn and Anne, seen their rises and ruins. She must have known what the crown cost. But still, she stepped forward. She asked little. She demanded nothing, save for one thing. She begged for Mary, Henry's daughter with Kathryn, to be restored. And in this, Henry softened. He allowed the reunion. Jane, in her gentle way, stitched together what others had torn. A small mercy in a house full of shadows. Then came the moment Henry had prayed for across two doomed marriages. A child. A son. Edward. Born in October of 1537 after a long and painful labor. The court erupted in joy. Bonfires were lit. Bells rang through fog. England exhaled. But Jane did not recover. Fever crept in quietly, as fevers do. Within 12 days, she was gone. She died not with drama, not with scandal, but with stillness. In white sheets, holding the infant heir who had cost her everything. Henry mourned her more deeply than any other wife. Perhaps because she died before she could disappoint him. Or perhaps, just perhaps, because in her silence, she had given him the one thing he craved most, legacy. He never remarried for years after. And when he died, nearly a decade later, he asked to be buried beside Jane. Not Kathryn. Not Anne. Just Jane, the quiet one. The one who stayed long enough to give, but not long enough to fall. And so, as her story fades into shadows, another begins. A portrait arrives in England. A stranger queen, chosen not by fate or flirtation, but by politics and paint. She came from across the sea, wrapped in warm furs and colder expectations. And of Cleves. A German princess. Unknown, unread, and utterly unprepared for the theatre she was stepping into. It was 1539. Jane Seymour had been gone 2 years, and Henry, now heavier, slower, and more haunted, found himself lonely once more. But he didn't wish to woo. No, those days were gone. He wished to negotiate. And so, his ministers scoured Europe for a fourth queen, one who could please the king and serve England's tangled foreign policy. And was chosen. Or rather, her portrait was. A man named Hans Holbein, painter to the powerful, had rendered her in soft detail. Modest eyes. High cheekbones. A quiet elegance. She looked agreeable. That was enough. Henry agreed to marry her before they ever met. But dear dreamer, as you well know, portraits do not always tell the truth. When Anne arrived in England, the king disguised himself and rushed to meet her, dreaming, perhaps, of romantic destiny. He entered her chambers unannounced, cloaked in courtly jest, hoping she would recognize her king and fall into delight at all. She did not. She barely noticed him. To Henry, this was humiliation. He sulked back to his court and declared her, "Nothing so fair as she hath been reported." Still, the wedding went ahead. Duty demanded it. But from the first day, Henry recoiled. He called her unattractive, unsophisticated, though truthfully it was not her looks, but her failure to flatter him, that sealed her fate. The marriage was never consummated. And, confused but obliging, waited quietly as Henry's affection withered. She had no allies. No power. And yet, she had something rare: luck. In July 1540, after just 6 months of uneasy marriage, the union was annulled. And here, dear dreamer, is where Anne's story turns gently sideways. She didn't protest. She didn't resist. She accepted the annulment with a gracious nod and was rewarded handsomely. Henry gave her houses, lands, a generous income. She remained in England, addressed as the king's beloved sister, and lived more freely than most queens ever dreamed. She played cards. She entertained. She smiled at banquets, unburdened by the weight of royal expectation. She even developed a cordial friendship with Henry, who found in her an absence of threat. And of Cleves outlived him, outlived all his other wives. She never remarried. She never sought a crown again. And perhaps, deep in the hush of her private chambers, she sometimes laughed softly at the painted girl in Holbein's portrait, the one who had entered history through a mistake, and left it with her head intact, her dignity unscathed. And so, as her story fades into shadows, another begins. She was barely 15 when the crown began to shimmer on the horizon. Kathryn Howard, young, pretty, playful. A girl of little education and less preparation. But in Henry's eyes, after the stillness of Anne of Cleves, she was sunlight breaking through the clouds. He was nearly 50. She was likely 17. He called her his rose without a thorn. He showered her with jewels, gowns, and praise. She brought laughter back to the palace, laughter and music, and the gentle perfume of youth. But underneath the silks and smiles was something fragile. Kathryn wasn't raised for queenship. She hadn't grown up in great halls or been shaped by caution. She was a Howard, noble by name, but not by pocket. Raised in a household more known for disorder than discipline. There were whispers, even before her coronation. Rumors of flirtations, letters passed, hearts entangled before she'd ever worn the crown. But Henry, charmed and besotted, didn't want to hear them. Or couldn't. He gave her everything. And yet, she was lonely. While he limped through court, nursing sores and shadows, she wandered the gardens, the halls, the secrets. She surrounded herself with young companions, some loyal, some not. And among them, a name began to rise: Thomas Culpeper. Handsome. Confident. Too confident. Whether their bond was flirtation or something deeper, we may never fully know. But notes were passed. Meetings were arranged in hushed chambers. And the walls of the Tudor court, they always had airs. In November of 1541, the truth, or what passed for it, came to light. Henry did not rage at first. He wept. Loudly. Publicly. Heartbroken not only by betrayal, but by the loss of his illusion. This girl, this rose without a thorn, had pricked him deeply. Kathryn was arrested. She was questioned. Her past dragged into the open like soiled linen. Lovers, real or alleged, were tortured. Confessions twisted from the mouths of the terrified. She was sent to the Tower. Unlike in Boleyn, Kathryn did not meet death with composed speeches or solemn grace. She was a child, and she was afraid. In her final days, she practiced placing her head on the execution block, again and again, as if preparing for sleep that would not hurt. On the morning of her execution, February 13th, 1542, she is said to have uttered these words: "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Whether those words were truly hers or embroidered by time, we cannot say. But the sadness remains. Not just in how she died, but in how she lived, so briefly, so brightly, and without armor. She was a girl handed a crown far too soon. And so, as her story fades into shadows, another begins. By the time Kathryn Parr entered Henry's world, the court was quiet with ghosts. 5 queens had worn the crown. 2 had lost their heads. 2 had been cast aside. 1 had died in childbed. The throne was no longer a glittering prize. It was a relic, cold and heavy with memory. Kathryn came not from foreign lands or great ambitions, but from widowhood. Twice married, twice widowed. Intelligent, composed, and painfully aware of the crown's cost. She didn't seek Henry's affection, not really. In fact, she was in love with another, Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane. But the king had made his choice, and when a tutor points, one does not refuse. So Kathryn set aside her heart and picked up the crown. It was 1543. Henry was old now, bloated, often in pain, his moods as shifting as coastal fog. Kathryn, clever as she was, saw what others had missed. He needed more than flattery. He needed care, respect, the illusion of control. She gave him all of that, and more. She nursed him through his illnesses, discussed theology and scripture at his bedside, published books, the first queen in English history to do so under her own name. She brought Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth back to court, helping to reconcile a fractured royal family. She was not a wife chosen for beauty or politics, but for sense, for steadiness. But even she would be tested. Kathryn had Protestant leanings, and Henry, though he had broken with Rome, remained theologically unpredictable. Her writings raised suspicion. Enemies at court whispered of her pride, her opinions, her heresy. A warrant for her arrest was drawn. She found it, by chance, and knew the storm was near. In a brilliant move of humility, she approached Henry and spoke not of theology, but of obedience. She said she had only ever argued with him to entertain him, to distract him from his ailments. That she, a mere woman, could never presume to instruct a man so wise. Henry, flattered, rescinded the warrant. Kathryn had outplayed him, with grace, and survival stitched into every word. She remained queen until his death in 1547. She had lasted, not by charm, not by seduction, but by wit and care, and the rare ability to see the man behind the mask. After Henry's passing, Kathryn married her true love, Thomas Seymour. At last, she followed her own heart. But happiness was fleeting. She died in childbirth in 1548, only a year later. Still, of all Henry's wives, she alone had walked away with her dignity, her mind, and her head. And so, her story fades, not into shadow, but into dawn. 6 queens, 6 lives, woven together by one man's restless hunger and history's unrelenting gaze. Some loved, some lost, one survived. Rest well now, dear dreamer. Until next time.